Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, depending on your time zone and when it is in the day you're viewing this. I suppose I could also say good night, but you probably should not be watching this at 3 a.m. in your time zone. I hope we're not going to put you to sleep that much. Welcome to Deploy Friday, the Platform S8 show, where we talk about tech stuff that is vaguely relevant to tech or something like that. Today, I've got a great show for you. We have two guests on to talk about funding free and open source software, what it is, why it means, why it's important, how to do it better. So please welcome our guests today, Pia Mancini and Luis Villa. Will be talking to us about funding. And I'm also joined, of course, by my colleague Otavio Santana from the Developer Relations team. And I'm your host for today, Larry Garfield, Director of Developer Experience. So let's kick it off. Pia, let's start with you. Give us who are you? What are you doing here? What's your 60-second hero origin story?
Hi, everyone. I'm Pia. I'm one of the founders and CEO of Open Collective. Open Collective is a platform that helps open source projects and other communities get funding by helping them interface with companies and do this without needing to have their own legal entity or bank account. And we currently support over 2,000 open source projects on the platform. We have a large organization that's called the Open Source Collective that we created for that. So yeah, really happy to be here and chat out more about that.
That's great. And we have a link to Open Collective in our show notes and the description down below. Luis, how about you? Tell us who you are, what you're doing here, what you do.
Yeah, so I'm the co-founder of Tidelift, which is a platform for making open source work better for everyone, both in the enterprise and the developers who are creating so much value for those enterprises. So we work to pay open source developers for some of the less fun work that they do, like licensing, security, but that is, maybe not something you want to do on your weekends just for fun, but that is incredibly valuable to the huge enterprises that rely on open source. So we provide the platform for that. We provide sales support. We provide legal support. And that's actually part of where I come in, is that I am, besides the co-founder, I'm the general counsel. I'm a former programmer turned lawyer. There are some lawyers out there who are still programmers. I should be honest with you. I have not written a line of useful code in a very long time, but I did worked for one of the original Linux
programmer. You're
yes,
recovering.
Programmer.
You never fully escape once it catches you.
That's well, yeah. The worst part is the projects you always say like, oh, it would be so much fun to code that. And then you think about it and like maybe even download a little code. Maybe you like I did write some Python in Anger about a year ago. No. I think it's even somewhere on GitHub if you look closely enough, but don't spare yourself.
I have some Anger coding projects out there myself.
Yeah.
So funding of free software and open source has been in the news a lot in the past week with the unfortunate news from Mozilla that they are shrinking considerably, which is not good. But let's take a step back. When we're talking about funding free software and open source, what do we actually mean by free and open source software? And why is that even important to think about in the first place? This is for either one of you.
Luis, do you want to take a stab at the
open
source software conversation?
Oh boy,
I realized we could do an entire episode just on that.
Yeah.
I think there are two important definitions here, right? There's a technical definition of free and open source software is software that is available to the public under a free or open source license, such as the GNU General Public License or the Apache license or the Mozilla Public License, which I co-authored the revision of a disturbingly long time ago now. But I think there's also this much bigger sense that free and open source software is a community. It's a community of communities, right? And it's not just, hey, we used these magic legal words to make it free and open, but we're doing this together with other people, right? And that is the legal part is thriving as much as it ever has. There's huge businesses built on it. Literally billions of lines of code out there that anybody can use under these licenses. But the Mozilla part, and where both Pia and I think are very, what we're trying to do, collective and try to make sure that community part is thriving as well.
Yeah, I think that something that why it's important part, and this is also a super large topic, but I always like to think about this in that free software is not really free. Someone else is paying for it. And the people that are paying for it are the maintainers and the developers that are investing their time in doing it, right? So yes, it's true. It's free in the sense that you do not have to pay for it in hard cash, but someone else is paying for it with their time, right? With time that they could have spent with their families or doing something else. So really, the problem of funding free and open source is related to the more meta problem or general problem of funding of the commons, right? Everything and anything that is a public good, and how we solve the incentives for funding it.
So wait, you're telling me that free software and open source doesn't just magically appear because volunteers just do things in their basement and code appears that I don't have to pay for? That's not how it works?
It's not automatically, no.
I've been lied to all this time.
We all have.
A lot of smart people have sat there and said with a very straight face that no, it just sort of magically, I had a professor who said, you wrap the internet around the earth, you spin the earth, and software comes out. It's like, he was well-intentioned when he said that. But I think, and perhaps there even was a time when that was true, right? I think there was, one of the things that has changed is that open source has gotten, well, all software, but including open source, has gotten progressively more complex. And so, maybe when I first started doing this, you could, in a weekend, hack something useful and put it out there. And, but now things like Kubernetes and, those are person centuries of effort. And so it doesn't quite, it's not quite as easy for this stuff to just magically appear.
Yeah, and I think that,
go ahead.
Yeah, no, that a framework that I find really useful about going back to the original, why we should fund this now, and maybe something that wasn't thought of before, is the kind of community imbalances. This is something that Michael Rogers, kind of a framework he uses, and I think it's really interesting. So the free and open source battle was a battle, right? It was a battle to convince companies to use free and open source software, about the value of it, right? And so winning that battle, making free and open source as successful, as ubiquitous, as relied on, as used as it is now, comes with the cost that you now have a lot more users than you have producers of open source, right? There's a huge imbalance between those who are using this piece of commons that is open source software or free and open source software. There's a huge imbalance between those who are using it and profiting from it, and those who are creating and not profiting from it. And so these big imbalances end up, kind of the burden of that, of the lion's share of that, ends up on the side of the maintainers, because of the nature of free and open source software, that it is a public good, and as such, you cannot limit access to it, right? So we need to figure out funding mechanisms that compensate this kind of community imbalance.
So let's break that down a bit further. In practice, who is actually writing free and open source software these days? I know, as I said, the historical kind of stereotype and image is the lone hacker in his parents' basement churning out code for the hell of it and eating Doritos, and so somehow Linux happens that way. To what extent is that even still slightly true today in 2020? And how much is volunteer code? How much is sponsored? What does that break down as?
It is really hard to give you real numbers there, because it all depends on what universe are you sampling from, how are you weighting things. Does Kubernetes count the same as, it's one project, does it count the same as all these other one projects that are much smaller? This is impossible to give, I think, meaningful numbers there. But I do think, I think this is, I would imagine that this is something that Open Collective sees as well. There are very valuable projects out there that don't have huge corporate support, don't have big fancy foundations, but are very valuable and are basically one person, right? The most downloaded project in Python, for example, is something called URLlib3. And it's basically a guy named Seth Larson, super nice guy, user of our platform, and yeah, literally, like, I think it's 1 billion downloads a month, and maybe 1 billion a year, doesn't matter, huge numbers. And so there are a lot of those projects out there, especially I think in some of the languages that encourage smaller libraries like Python and JavaScript. They're out there, they're huge, but they're not, they don't necessarily get the same recognition or the same attention as the Kubernetes of the world, which are very corporate driven, supported very directly by Google and all the other large companies in our space, right? So both of those things are happening. I think it's important to acknowledge that there's not that small producer aspect of free and open source hasn't gone away. It's still very large. It just tends not to get the same kind of attention.
Yeah, I think that a good way of thinking about this is also kind of, if you look at the stack and the different levels of the stack. And so like the more open source, free and open source operating systems are more stable, they have larger communities because they're older, or the growing time, they don't change that much. The way you, as you go up the stack, like maybe frameworks, and they change way more often. So you have like a lot more, there are like, hot frameworks, and suddenly some of them attract a lot of people, and then they stop attracting a lot of people. And so you have maintainers maintaining something that was, used before, but it's not really used as much anymore, but people depend on it. So it's quite kind of a complex, it's obviously a very complex ecosystem. And then you also have the difference within that complexity. You also see the difference between projects that have a lot of people creating software, right? Like making pull requests for new features and new things. And the people who are maintaining it, which is, I think, something that Tidelift saw really well. And it's like there's some communities that they don't really get new features all the time, but the work of maintaining whatever has been done before others moved on to the next hot framework, it's still a lot of work, right? And someone has to do that work and is responsible for that, right?
That's
I mean, it's
myself.
Oh,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
That's something I saw myself in a previous life when I was working on Drupal. That some projects, the line between maintainer and user is extremely porous, and so you have a very large number of very minor contributors. And other projects where there's 4 people writing everything and 4 million people using it, and it's still, both of them are still open source, both of them are still free software, but it creates an extremely different dynamic around how the software is conceptualized and how people feel about the software and what if any responsibility they have to it, I think, as well. So Luis, you were saying?
Well, I think we moved in a slightly different direction. I will say, one thing that has changed over the past 20 years in open source. It's harder and harder to generalize about it.
Yeah.
To say what is open source, right? And there's just it, you know, like Pia was saying, different parts of the stack have different qualities. Different languages have different qualities. You know, I mean, I was looking at something for a customer the other day, and they're using a Java library that is old enough to drive. And you know, and basically there's no such thing as a JavaScript library that is that old,
Yeah.
right? And there's just you know, and that was a totally reasonable. Sometimes you see stuff.
Uh-oh, we might be losing Louise.
It was actually a totally reasonable, you know, this is a totally reasonable thing, right? So it's really hard to generalize these days.
Indeed, I have two one step back question, because we speak too much about free software and open source. When you go to the Google search something, usually we saw two huge foundation. The first one is Free Software Foundation, and the second one is Open Source Institute, something like that. My first question is there any difference between them? I mean, when should I go to Free Software Foundation? When should I go to Open Source Institute?
Yeah, I mean,
I know how I would answer this, but I want you two to answer it.
So I am a former member of the board of directors of the Open Source Initiative. So I have, and I'm a card-carrying member. Well, I used to be a card-carrying member of the Free Software Foundation. There's some political, they have some leadership challenges, so I'm no longer a member, but that's for a different call. So, I mean, I think they are mostly doing the same thing. The slight difference between the two historically is that the Free Software Foundation was much more interested in software freedom as a sort of philosophical question, and the Open Source Initiative much more interested as a how do we build better businesses, better, pragmatically better software, right? Less buggy, more robust. These days, there's a lot of, I think almost all of the members of the current Open Source Initiative board are members of the Free Software Foundation. There was a time when the two fought very bitterly, but that time is now past. And they, you know, but there is still that sort of core difference of philosophy versus pragmatic, I would say.
Yeah, the way I've usually described it, since this is an area I have feels as well, free software, it prioritizes the independence of the end user and the freedom of the end user. Open source is about the development process itself. And fortunately, those two overlap 98% in practice, but they are different focuses. And so you might make slightly different compromises depending on which approach you're taking. For example, in how you go about funding your project so that the developers working on a project have the, as you were saying, the time to do the boring maintenance and feature development and answer support and so on, which is an excellent segue into, okay, and how do I do that? So if you've got, you know, if you have an open source project or free software project that you're working on either individually or as a company sponsored thing, someone's got to eat. And hopefully someone's going to eat a lot, given that free software generates just so much value. Our economy today would not function without free software. There wouldn't be an internet economy. So what are some of the different ways that people have gone about making sure that people actually maintaining free software and building free software have the resources they can devote their time to that, both historically and currently? What are some of the options for making sure that happens?
So historically, what has happened is, or more traditionally, I think it's two approaches. One of them is the big foundation that supports kind of the whole ecosystem, a la Linux Foundation, for example. They get funding from corporations, and then they hire developers to work on the source code. They take care of legal issues, branding, trademarks, the whole jazz. so that's one approach that has certainly been very successful for the Linux community. The Linux Foundation is very well funded. The other approach, which is a little bit more decentralized, is more of a corporate approach. For its companies hire developers to work on open source software they use, right? Or they create software themselves internally that is open source, like React, for example, right? But it's in the realm of a corporation. Other people can contribute, other people can use it. It's open source, but it clearly has a lot of incidence or influence from that corporation. Sometimes it happens, like Electron, for example, that several companies hire people to work on that source code because they use it for their own applications, right? Like it's the example of Electron with GitHub and Slack. And so that's the kind of the two traditional models. Either companies hire people in their payroll, or the community has like a foundation behind it. And then after that, you have different approaches. One of them is, and Tidelift and Open Collective are examples of like new approaches or new ways of sustaining open source or funding open source outside of companies and outside of like the traditional large all-encompassing foundation, right? So on the Open Collective side, we work with project-directed funding, right? So we essentially interface with companies for the companies to give funding directly to the projects. And then the maintainers decide how they spend that money, what they spend it on. Each project has their own kind of governance system, how they decide who should get paid for what. And our role is really providing the financial mechanism for that to happen. The reason why you need a financial mechanism is because if Google wants to give money to Webpack, for example, or Babel, Webpack or Babel are a community of maintainers and developers that are coming together to do software, but they're not a legal entity. They're not incorporated in the world. They cannot interface with a corporation, because a company needs to be able to send money to another corporation, like not random individuals, right? And what I call like the kind of the big hole that the internet left is this problem where we know how to come together and collaborate and cooperate online and produce. Like we know how to come together and be creative online. We do not know, because we don't have the mechanisms to fund that creativity in a way that makes sense in the world, right? Because you either have corporations or the individual, but you do not have a mechanism to fund the community as such, right? And open source projects, if they're anything, they are communities. That's what they are, unincorporated groups of people that come together to produce something in the world. And so Open Collective's kind of mission is to become that, the plumbing, the infrastructure on top of which companies can get project-directed funding. Companies and foundations, right, can send project-directed funding. And then Tidelift, I'm gonna let Luis talk about that model.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty good summary of the of where things were before the current time, because I think Pia is exactly right that we've increasingly started realizing, and I think a lot of people, you know, Larry, you mentioned Mozilla at the beginning of the call, and this was you know, I think it was timely that we were already scheduled for this week. That you know, the big challenge that has always been the case, right? Because Linux Foundation's wild success, it is now a huge organization, is relatively recent. Linux Foundation had to do big layoffs in the early 2000s. Like, they really struggled with this question of how do we convince people to pay for this development, right? And so this actually, this idea that foundations are going to do it is in some ways relatively recent, and certainly at the scale that we're seeing with Linux Foundation or Mozilla has been somewhat recent, right? And always the eternal question is, okay, well, how do you get somebody to pay for it, right? Now, one of the solutions has been put a SaaS wrapper around it, and and which I think has in many ways been pretty good for open source overall, right? There's quite a few companies. I mean, in some ways, you can think of Facebook and Google as SaaS wrappers around open source that take in a lot of money from advertising and spin out a lot of open source, right? And
as we've seen, there are costs and downsides to that model.
Absolutely. We're only here for an hour, so I can only go so far. But but it is one way that has happened. And I think what what we saw when we were starting Tidelift, it's a little bit of a digression about our history as a company. So I was involved in, like, right after college, I went to work for a Linux desktop startup in the first year of the Linux desktop, many ages ago. And then I went to work. I worked one summer at Red Hat while I was in law school. I worked at Mozilla and I worked at Wikipedia. And my co-founders all were at Red Hat for many years. And what we saw was a world where there was a lot of open source with a lot of value. People were pouring their hearts into this, and what they were getting for it was the right to, like, put that on their resume and try to turn that into another job, which might or may not have anything to do with the with the work that they actually were passionate about, right? I mentioned URL lib3, which is a Python project. The maintainer's an amazing guy. What's he working on in his day job now? I think it's Go, right? And there's nothing wrong with Go, right? But, like, he was not able to find quite that match of his passion and, okay, but what can I get paid to do, right? And I don't want to make it sound like he dislikes his current job. He seems to be currently enjoying it, right? But, like, it's not the match of the money and the job was not quite right. And so what we see at Tidelift, and what we hope someday to make happen for Seth, is there are hundreds of thousands of companies using this software, if not millions using this software. How do we convince them to each spend a little bit of money, not donate, critically for us, not donate, not give out of the kindness of their hearts, but see some enterprise value that they're willing to pay recurring amounts of money for. It's the difference. I think, sometimes people, they're like, oh, you're like the Kickstarter of open source. It's like, no, Kickstarter is a one-time thing, right? We almost want to be more like Spotify, where you are using this all the time. You're constantly listening to this music. So we measure what you're using. And then we contact those maintainers and we say, hey, you know what? There are all these companies using this stuff. Sign up for our platform. Do some of this basic, not super fun, but licensing, security. We're hoping to add some things like
I think we're
code of
losing
conduct enforcement.
audio here, unfortunately.
Oh no.
I was hearing him properly though.
Yeah, that's fine on my side as
Maybe
well.
it's me that's losing audio. So you keep talking, I'll play with audio on my end.
All right. I was just saying that what we have is a situation where we hope that with a sales team and with with a long experience in enterprise, we can essentially package up all these maintainers, sell them to the enterprise, and create a really good recurring revenue stream for them, right? And I realize I'm using very boring enterprise. Like, I listen to my recordings of these things sometimes. It's like, Lewis, where did you go wrong, right? Like, you're saying recurring revenue streams, but the thing is if we want people to really convert open source from, like, the thing they do on weekends to a thing they can really make their real job, then we have to speak this language, and we have to think about I I shouldn't say we have to speak this language, right? I mean, I think I want to make clear it's easy to set us as in opposition to some of these other things, and like genuinely, as I was saying earlier, big space, there's so much money here that there's going to be some projects that charity actually does work for, right? Like, listen, I worked for Wikimedia. I still very much love Wikimedia. Charity can work for the right projects, right? And a mix of consulting and other thing, and like proprietary plugins, for example, might work for other projects. SaaS might work for other projects. Tidelift is, I mean, it would be amazing somehow if Tidelift was the only model at some point, but that seems highly unlikely, and it's not our goal, right? Like, we think there's a lot of different ways this can happen for different projects, and we always want to make sure, we have projects that are both on Tidelift and on Open Collective, or on Tidelift and GitHub sponsors. Like, we don't see ourselves as exclusive. Larry, do I have you back now, or are you just nodding along because you see my lips have stopped moving?
I have one question about that. Can I combine organizations? For example, we have Eclipse Foundation, who has several open source projects. We also have Apache Foundation, who also has amazing open source projects. So if you have an open source project from Apache or Eclipse Foundation, can I submit to Open Collective or to Tidelift?
Yeah. So, yeah, sure. So Tidelift, I think, has more of a maintainer focused model where they pay maintainers personally, individually, I mean, and Open Collective has more of a community approach. So we essentially are set out to support communities. So nothing prevents you from having your collective that you use to receive funding for your community. You can pay bounties from there. You can pay maintainers from there. You pay for your operation costs, or better onboarding documentation, or better documentation in general, or translating your software, right? Design, all of those things that you can do for your community. And then individually do work for Tidelift, or even individually have Patreon account, right? So Vue, I think Evan Yu is an example that I think he has everything under the sun, which is great because he's trying everything. But he has a very successful Patreon. Vue.js is a thriving community on Open Collective, and we've been paying several maintainers like a regular salary from their community. And I don't know, maybe Luis, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he was also part of Tidelift, or the initial kind of Tidelift. Yeah.
So, yeah. So, yeah, and we, and we also work with, we work with the Python Software Foundation. We work with Ruby Together, so we can do the paying out to a community as well. Though there are, we've been, I think, more successful with the individual maintainers, but that's less by design and more just the way it has sort of tended to work out for right now. But yeah, we think these are complementary, right? There's no reason that if you're an Apache project, you can work with us. And we've had conversations with Apache, but I mean, Apache is, I think, actually one of the interesting, we were talking about how open source contains multitudes. Even Apache contains multitudes these days. I think there's something like 100 Apache projects, and each of them with their own governance. They have certain shared rules, but other things are not shared, right? So, yeah, I mean, and we have maintainers who on Tidelift who, you can almost think of them as, this is oversimplifying a little, so Pia should feel free to clarify a little bit, but we're very concerned with how do you get money in. Open Collective is very concerned with how you get money out, right? And so there are, those are complementary in a lot of ways.
So kind of the canonical archetypical model for Tidelift would be the OpenSSL guy.
Yeah.
Who is one person who maintains a library that is super useful, super important, used by thousands of companies, and no one knows who he is. So companies that use OpenSSL say all of them throw you $10 a month, and then you aggregate that and throw that to him. Whereas Open Collective, your kind of archetypical idea is you've got a project that's a community of 10 people and 100 other volunteers who are there occasionally, and you want some organization like a association or foundation for hire, or an off-the-shelf foundation, so that you can say, all right, we need to hire a designer to work on this interface. So this is the mechanism by which that gets managed. Is that kind of
so at a like higher level, Open Collective tries to give economic power to communities, and they can decide how they spend it. But essentially, we help. For example, last year, Samsung gave away $500,000 to decentralization projects on Open Collective, right? For Samsung, it's impossible to deal with each different community, right? And onboard them to their, you want to throw yourself off the window kind of vendor process, right? That is like the Samsung vendor process, or don't even get me started with like Microsoft or Google or, anyway. So it's a really high bar, and projects can't do it because most of them don't have legal entities behind them, right? And so essentially what we do is we negotiate with Samsung. We bring in all the money to one of our legal entities, and then the projects kind of receive each their contribution and spend against that funding. So yeah, that's essentially how it works.
So Samsung gives you $500,000, and then that is earmarked for
correct
decentralization. And then all the projects that you have listed as these are decentralization type projects get together and divvy.
There are different mechanisms. Yes, that's one option. Also, Samsung can say we already did our grants, selection process. We want you to give money to all of these projects. So yes, and sometimes obviously individuals give money to their projects. Like we have a lot of individuals giving $5 donations or contributions. We also have companies that support a project, for example, at a large scale, and then they have support from that project, or it's like hiring a maintainer, but instead of hiring the maintainer, they kind of give that maintainer salary to the whole community, and then the community can spend it on different people. So, I mean, the basic idea is that we are a platform that helps companies disperse money to unincorporated communities, and open source obviously being an unincorporated community in general.
Yeah, and we've helped with a lot of the same kinds of questions, right? Slightly different spin, but look, if you're a big company and you want to give $5 a month to every single one of your dependencies, you're going to spend a lot more in legal overhead than you are on that $5 a month, right? And so what we allow you to say is give us, $5,000 a month, and we will take care. We already have relationships with a lot of the maintainers. We will help you take care of that part of it, right? Because they don't, they don't want to figure that out, right? And then we bundle that with other services to make sure that that's actually a good value for the company.
So, suppose I'm a independent developer or a small team. We built some volunteerware project that's under some kind of free or open license, and it's getting traction. Companies are using it. We're starting to get support requests. We're starting to get nasty support requests from people who assume that it's free, therefore stuff magically happens. And I want to start transitioning to, can we make this sustainable? Can we do this full time? Can any of us do this full time? What advice would you give to either a solo person or a team for how you make that transition from volunteerware on weekends to some kind of sustainable project that can afford to pay people market rate to work on some of these things? Because market rate for high-end developers is a lot of money, especially there's some things going around. I saw that the really high-level engineers you need for something like Mozilla working on Servo or Gecko and the other engine pieces, that's more than $250,000 a year, because those kind of people are so high level and in such high demand. So market rate is not pizza money. How do you transition a project from volunteerware to sustainable market rate funding safely and smoothly? How do you do that?
So the first thing I would say is forget about market rate, especially at the $500,000 a year. I think that if that's your expectation,
yeah, that's a very small minority, but
yeah, okay. So just
not $30,000.
I think that setting the right expectations is kind of a really good first step in that sense. So I've helped maintainers transition out of working for a corporation to working full time for their community, and obviously they're not making that much money, but they're making a very, very decent salary a year from their communities, right? I think the first thing I would say is also when it's just a volunteer project at the moment, you need to stop thinking of sustainability as just money. You need to start thinking about sustainability in a more holistic kind of way, right? Sustainability is as much financial sustainability as it is sustainability of the community, right? So I would say start by doing things that increase the number of people that interact with your project. Make sure that you have good onboarding practices, that you are opening up to other people contributing and maintaining, that you have a well-established core team, right, that can help you make decisions and governance of the project. And then the financial aspect of it is one of those elements, right? It's one of the things that you need to look at. Because at least in my experience with Open Collective, you can get very quickly to say, I don't know, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 a month. You get reasonably quickly to receiving that amount of money. But the jump from that to being able to support someone full-time or two people full-time, like it's quite a big gap. Like, so we have a couple of projects that are very successful at the top. And I mean, like they've raised, $300,000, $400,000 a year, right? We have some projects in that area. Then you have a bunch of projects on $50,000 to $100,000, and then a lot below that. But when you go way below that, so when you have $20,000 a year, it's really difficult to know what to spend it on, right? So that's what I'm saying. I would stop thinking of sustainability just money and would start thinking about also community, because then you can use that money that you have, the $5,000 a month, for example, to support things to increase your community, right? And once you have a more thriving community, you're going to have more people working on the software. You're going to have like better chances of, having less of your time invested in maintaining, or you're going to be able to free some of your time to do something like potentially sales, a more salesy or branding kind of role, right? And that's, again, it's going to help you bring in more funding. So I always
start.
Yeah.
If I'm understanding correctly, you're saying don't start with how do I get people paid to work on the software. It's how do I get things paid to do everything except work on the software so I can just work on the software.
So either that, or how do I get funding to support and grow my community, right? Because then you'll have more people not only working on the software, but you're going to be able to free yourself to do other things like fundraising, because fundraising is tough and it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't fall off the trees. You don't just have a collective and then people give you money. They might give you $1,000 a month or $2,000 a month, but that's not enough, obviously, to have a sustainable project, right? So my suggestion is like start by growing your community, start by getting funding. Obviously, have a collective if you want, or any other platform that you want to use to get some funding, but invest that money early on in growing your community. I think that's like a super key aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, I would start with, of course, I mean, I think, a lot of what Pia said is 100% correct. I'd add, you need to think about your open source as a product, right? that it is that the thing that you are building is something that other people have to want to use, right? And a healthy, thriving community, I think, as we all know, is a key part of that, right? Because a healthy, thriving community are often your best sales and marketing, are often your the people who are helping you with. No open source maintainer or almost zero open source maintainers are masters of all of the different things you have to do to be good, to have a valuable open source project these days, right? And so it might be that you just might not like writing docs, right? And so figure out how the community is going to grow in a way that gets some people in who like writing docs, or so I think that's thinking about how it is that you make your project awesome, that the people will really want to use it and people will really want to be engaged. That is both a community strategy question, but it's also a what is it that you're building, right? And I think maybe one thing where I don't think Pia and I would disagree, but maybe a slightly different emphasis is, a lot of small open source projects are probably not ever going to reach that critical mass of community. And so because the nature of open source these days is not, we used to talk about the LAMP stack, Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, or Perl, or whatever. You had 4 choices. That was the thing, right? And now, you do a hello world and it has 900 libraries, right? And so some of those 900 libraries are going to get awesome, healthy communities, but many hundreds of them are not, right? And so thinking about how, one thing that I would urge people, some of the most successful people on our platform are people who have done dozens or hundreds of those kinds of things, right? Who have looked at this as a more this one thing, which was fun for me to do, is valuable and a lot of people are using it, but I have to do 20 of those if I'm gonna be successful, right? Because just that one is not gonna be good enough. I think what Pia said about redefining success is super important, because one of the things that I think we talked a little bit about how open source has changed. A thing that the people who most love free and open source, in my experience, are the people who have used that to empower themselves in a way that's beyond money, right? That they've built networks of friendships, they've built flexibility in their lives, right? And that is something, certainly having $250,000 a year helps build flexibility in your life. But
maybe. It's unclear.
If you're working an 80-hour week, that's not
that's the thing, right? There are probably going to be many situations where making much less, but doing it in a way that you're really your own boss, is actually going to be much more personally satisfying. Don't get me wrong, the first day that Tidelift is paying somebody $250,000 a year, I'm gonna pop myself a bottle of champagne, because I think that will be great for them.
To be clear for the audience, I don't expect every engineer to make that much. Just pointing out that.
Well, I mean, but it is,
people assume that, oh, you're making $1,000 a month off this. That's certainly plenty. Why do you need any more than that?
One of the things that we're excited about, one of the things that we're excited about, and I'm sure Pia is excited about as well, so much of the terms of our industry are set by Silicon Valley. And look, I live in Silicon Valley. My wife is a California native. I'm pretty, as such things go, I'm actually pretty pro Silicon Valley. But it's crazy that we set so much of the discussion on the terms of, we have developers all over the world. I'm sure Open Collective does as well. And what constitutes success in some places is very different from what we talk about with with servo maintainers, right? And I think certainly part of the thing that I think this was a transition that was already happening. I'm pretty sure I mean, Open Collective, you all don't have an office, right? Like,
No, we don't. We have developers, and our team is 100% remote. But we were born remote, so I guess it was always the case. We didn't transition to a remote company. I'm not sure how that will go.
Yeah, we were born mostly or half and half, right? Like of our four founders, two were in Boston and I was in California, one was in North Carolina. And we always had planned to be somewhere before the pandemic hit. We were about a third in Boston, 2/3 remote. Obviously at this point, it seems hard to imagine us going back there, back to the office in any meaningful way. But again, we were already prepared for it, right? Because we had always done all our meetings remotely and all those kinds of things. And so I think part of what we're going to see in open source is more diversity in more economic diversity. And I think this is something that's important for both Pia and I. Hopefully more diversity of other forms, right? And part of why open source is so is even less diverse than software as a whole is because for a long time it required a lot of economic privilege to get involved, right? It was something, the way you got involved was you worked on your weekends, and you know what? Not everybody has spare weekends. You may be caring for a family, you may have health challenges, like not everybody has that kind of or like me, I got involved in college in part because if my grades weren't so great, then like it was gonna be fine, right? And so I could play around on the internet with like open source, right? Which seemed at the time, I remember I was like, I think I'm gonna make a job out of this, and my father thought I was insane. And then he's a subscriber to Forbes magazine, which Americans will know as like this like very fancy business magazine, and Linus was on the cover. And then my dad was like, oh, okay, I still don't understand, but like,
it's
maybe
Forbes endorsed, therefore it's real.
Right. And so, but the people who were involved were people whose parents had Forbes subscriptions. Mm-hmm. And that created a certain amount of the culture and required a lot of privilege. And certainly one of my goals for Tidelift, and I'm sure one of Pia's for Open Collective as well, is that by changing the economic structure that underlies open source, we can make it a much more welcoming and friendly place for everybody.
For sure.
We do have a question from the audience. I want to get in, and then we're running low on time here. Chad Carlson asks, does my choice of a particular license matter if I'm trying to get started with either Open Collective or Tidelift? Hopefully this is a short question.
Nope. We love all licenses.
But it has to be some kind of open source friendly license, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so any OSI approved license will do.
For sure.
I have one question about that. How can I choose the best license to my project?
Oh my God.
Oh, okay.
That's an episode
I'm
unto
sorry,
itself.
we only have 7 minutes left. I will say there's a lot out there. I think you do want to think about what's important to you and how you want to make this a sustainable thing or not, right? And the different licenses will do different things in terms of how open your community is to all kinds of contribution, how much control you have. There's a lot that's been written out there on that kind of stuff, so I won't bore everybody with repeating that. But it is, think about what kind of community you want to build and what kind of project you want to build, and the license is an important part of that.
Yeah.
Here's a hard question. Well, maybe it's a hard question. It's a good one to go out on. So this is great. Say my company uses a lot of open source, a lot of free software tools like every company out there these days. And I feel we should be giving back to at least some of them, the ones that don't already have massive funding. Like Linux Foundation has a lot more money than the URL lib maintainer. How do I go about convincing my boss, hey, we should be giving money to the OpenSSL maintainer, the URL lib maintainer, the the maintainer of this library over here, of this framework over here, the hundreds of projects we use that you don't even think about, how do I make the case that, yes, we're getting this stuff for free and we should therefore give money for it?
That's a great question. So I think it's the way we try to frame it is like it's a smart business decision when you invest in the products that you're using in your own product. Essentially, you want to make sure that you support and sustain the community that is behind that software, because you're going to be using it, you're going to be integrating it. You want a community that is alive and thriving, and someone who can reply to your questions out there. You want to make sure that updates are being done, that patches are being made, that the community has updated documentation, because it's the documentation that your team is going to be using to build your software. So I think I would use that framework. That's at least is a framework that we use. And also we think about it as investments and not as donations or, just giving money away. You're investing in a project, in a product that you are using and your team is using every single day. There's another argument that has been very successful for us that is kind of employee retention argument. If your engineering community is happy, if your engineering staff are happy because you're supporting the projects that are making their lives easier, right? They're all going to be working in a company that they're going to be happier working for that company because they know that that company is supporting their own communities, right? You potentially want to hire someone from that community. So your company needs, it's also a branding exercise for you, right? And we have concrete evidence of this. Like, for example, Trivago, a company based out of Düsseldorf in Germany, they are big investors in the Webpack community, and they've noticed the type of developer that applies to them changing when they started supporting so publicly Webpack. Actually, people were saying, we are applying to work for you because we know how invested you are in the Webpack or in the open source ecosystem, right? So that's a very powerful argument that helps move this up the chain internally.
So it almost becomes kind of an HR expense for...
Absolutely.
HR marketing in a sense.
You want to use a product, a software to build your own product. You want to hire someone who knows that software well. You're likely going to find it in that community. You want to make sure you're also part of that community. Corporations are part of open source communities. They need to be active, responsible stakeholders of those communities. And funding them is a way of doing it.
Yeah, the short answer, since we're running out of time, is talk to Tidelift's sales team. And I think the slightly longer and more serious answer is that, related to some of the things that Pia was saying, we think that we have a phrase we call managed open source, right? And the idea is that we are providing you with an open source that is of known, reliable quality through partnering with the maintainers, so that instead of spending your time, what's the license, what's the most secure release, we take care of all that for you and present that to you as part of our product. And the way we do that is then by paying the maintainers. And so the sales pitch internally becomes not, how do we support the maintainers, but rather how do we improve developer velocity by using the right open source, right? Stuff that we know is maintained, that we know the developers are engaged. And how do we do that? By applying money to the problem and by applying Tidelift's tooling to the problem, right? So that we integrate with your CI so that you can see like, this is unmaintained, this is unsupported, this is insecure, this is, who knows what the licensing is. Tavia, one answer to your question is pick a license. You'd be shocked how many people don't do that, right? And again, where our money comes in is to help make sure that kind of stuff actually happens. And so when you talk to us, engage with our sales team, pay us money, we help you bring in managed open source into your company so that it is, so that as P was saying, the developer experience is better. You're really helping morale, helping your legal team. You know, we talk to customers like, oh, it takes us weeks to figure out what the license is. We can, you know, we can help you with that, right?
Yeah.
And we can help
Footnote
clear
for
up
anyone
questions
maintaining.
too.
Yeah,
Was that?
footnote for anyone maintaining a project. Under current US copyright law and copyright law of most countries at this point, if you don't have a licensed TXT file or a license file in your GitHub repo, it is a felony for anyone to use your code. Put a license on it of some kind.
Yeah. I mean, that's, again, we can do a whole nother Ask a Lawyer segment. And in fact, I will, if you go to Tidelift, you'll see the Tidelift website, you'll see I'm doing a seminar on the nerdy licensing questions in a couple weeks. So if you're actually curious about those, you can come hear me talk about that. Nobody should actually do this. Like, it's boring as anything, but I will try to make it less boring.
I've given those presentations before myself. I totally nerd out on the licensing and the philosophy and so on. So well, this has been wonderful. Do either of you have any closing thoughts before
I
we
look
wrap
forward to
up?
your sign up.
Sorry?
Oh, I was just going to say, then I look forward to your sign up for the seminar. No, you know, I mean, my closing thought is simply like, this is still early days. I think there's a lot of people, you know, there were still a lot of people who thought you just shook the magic open source tree and code fell out. And I'm excited to be working on this problem. I'm excited to get to spend time with people like Pia, who are also, you know, deeply thoughtful and caring about this problem. There's a lot of smart people working on this, so I'm really optimistic. You know, and it's a real problem, but it's also a fun problem to work on. So I'm excited.
Pia, any closing thoughts?
No, thank you so much for opening this space and listening, and I don't know, I guess encouraging everyone to be kind and gentle with open source maintainers, because they work a lot, it's very tough, and they receive a lot of help for, you know, bringing something beautiful into the world. So yeah, be kind.
Yes. Please be nice to your open source maintainers. They're being kind to you. Please be kind back.
Yeah, and if they're not, tell them, because sometimes they're
not. All right, that about wraps it up for today. Thank you to Pia and Luis for joining us today. Thank you, Otavio, for helping keep things moving. Tune in next week. We'll be talking about, we have Robert and Chad from our team talking about Jamstack and Next.js. So JavaScript fans, this one's for you. And with that, I will bid you a happy Friday. Go forth and deploy, because every day is a safe day to deploy if you're using Platform SH. Take care.